You're watching Spectator TV. You're watching a special edition of Spectator TV. We're going to speak to Anders Tegnell. He is the Swedish epidemiologist who has been the architect of Sweden's approach to COVID, which has been very different from most of the approaches elsewhere in Europe, indeed elsewhere in the world. And that's why we're very grateful that we can talk to him today. Anders, welcome to Spectator TV. Thank you for coming back. I want to talk about where we are now, but before I do, I want to just kind of look at Sweden's record over the past 6 months. Now, Sweden has had to date 580 COVID-related deaths per million. That's not far off Britain's 613 deaths per million. Nobody thinks Britain's been a success story in handling this COVID. So why should Sweden be regarded as a success story?
I'm not sure anybody of us can be regarded as a success story yet. I think that's a very dangerous thing to say. We're all struggling. We're all trying to find ways to deal with this very different kind of pandemic that we're seeing in front of us. When it comes to the death toll, I think in Britain and in many other places, but definitely in Sweden, there is a very complicated background to that. You can't just look at the figures. You also need to understand in what context this happened. And we obviously had a clear weakness in our elderly homes, the long-term care facilities, especially in the Stockholm area and some surrounding regions. And that proved to be a big problem when it comes to COVID-19. It has been a problem before with flu and with antibiotic resistance and so on, but not nearly as big as it was now. So there was a big spread. And in that group of people, there were about 70,000 people in Sweden. Most of them are very frail. They have multiple other diseases, they're very old and so susceptible to have a fatal kind of disease. Now, when we have worked quite a lot with those long-term care facilities, we are down to almost no spread in them, and that has also meant that our death toll is down to very low levels. Of course, we all wish that that could have been done earlier, but this was a flaw in our system that we partly knew about, but didn't really realize the complete extent to what it would do to us.
I appreciate the picture is always very complicated and statistics don't always prove one thing or caused by one thing. But what I'm trying to look at is evidence that not having a lockdown of the kind that Britain had or France had has been more successful than having a lockdown. I mean, because Sweden has fared worse than its Scandinavian neighbors, and they had lockdowns. Deaths per million in Norway are just 49. That's less than a tenth of Sweden's. Denmark's 110. That's less than a fifth of Sweden's. Finland, 61, just over a tenth of Sweden's. I mean, by these metrics, how could we regard Sweden as, let's not say success, as having done well?
Yeah, but first of all, you have to realize the pandemic in Sweden has been quite different to what it's been in our neighboring countries, due probably to a huge influx of people very early on when the Stockholm area had its winter vacation and a lot of Stockholmers came back with the disease. And it meant that we have a huge start of it. And there was absolutely no way we could have handled it the way it was handled in Finland and Norway because there was just too many cases. So when I talk to my UK or my Dutch colleagues, they describe the pandemic in the UK and the Netherlands, which is very similar to the way it developed in Sweden. So I think that's a much more relevant comparison to have. And there you can say, okay, so what difference did a lockdown do? We don't really believe a lockdown might have done a lot of things and might have slowed down the pandemic, but it would probably not have saved very many people in our elderly homes because these people need constant contact with the surroundings. I mean, they need several visits a day. Many of them need 24-hour care. And that's the situation it is.
You mentioned that in the early days, so many of Sweden's fatalities happened in care homes, perhaps as many as 50% of in the early days I've seen it. But even if you take out Swedish care home fatalities, take them out from the Swedish figures altogether, Norway and Denmark still had far fewer fatalities.
Yes, that's true. But once again, their kind of pandemic, at least so far, has been hugely different than the Swedish one. And I think there's a number of reasons to that. I mean, one reason is that the pandemic started differently in Sweden. In a way, that, especially in the Stockholm area, there was no way that our health system could handle it the same way they did in Norway and Finland. But also that we have a big population of migrants that are in socioeconomic not so well circumstances, which is much more similar to what you can see in the Netherlands and UK. Those groups are very much smaller in Finland and in Norway, and we can tell that a lot of the fatalities and a lot of the morbidity early on was in these groups.
We look at Sweden and always think it is one of the finest welfare systems in the world, a cradle-to-grave system. Why, Anders, was Sweden so badly prepared when it came to care homes, as we were in this country? But we've always known that our care homes are the kind of poor relation to our National Health Service. Why was Sweden so badly prepared?
Maybe in a similar manner, because 25, 30 years ago, the care homes were moved away from the hospital system and moved into the social welfare system. And there were many good reasons for that, and it became much more of a home for these people living there, which I think has many, many positive aspects. But at the same time, the contact to medical care, medical expertise, medical resources became very scant. And I think that worked in normal circumstances, but when there was a heavy kind of health threat to them, the loss of health practice in those became very apparent. This has been mentioned in several reviews over the years, and it been discussed extensively what to do about it. And we just had a meeting with the Commission that's going to look into this today. And I think we're all clear that at this stage, there really needs to be some dramatic changes to do that, to make these places a much safer home in the future.
It certainly, I think, is making every country look at its care homes now as a result of this. Now, there was a time back in March when the British government was thinking of following Sweden with no lockdown. Then Neil Ferguson's Imperial College model forecast 500,000 deaths without lockdown. And it looked to us and from the outside that the government then panicked and said, that's it, we need a lockdown. Was the government, British government, wrong to panic in the face of these figures?
No, I don't think I can really review that. I mean, every country has to sort of deal with the situation they end up in. And there was a very dramatic increase in Great Britain at that time. And I can really understand there was a great need to do something. In Sweden, the increase was much more gradual. And we managed to keep our health care system running all the time. I mean, there was always beds free for any COVID person who needed treatment. So the situation never really developed that far in Sweden. And I think that's why we managed to keep the track we started on all through.
The imperial modeling implied, when some Swedish academics got hold of the data, implied there would be 85,000 deaths in Sweden with no lockdown. Why didn't you panic?
Partly because we looked at the model and we could see that the variables that were put into the model were quite extreme in our view. And that was also done by other academic people in Sweden, and we all agreed. And that can, of course, be discussed afterwards. Why did you choose the kind of variables that gave this kind of extreme results? So we were always quite doubtful that this was really be the development, and we did some work on our own that pointed in a quite different direction. And in the end, it proved that our prognosis were much closer to the real situation, actually very close to the real situation. Probably because we really used data that we felt that we could understand, and data that came from the actual situation and were not coming from some kind of theoretical model.
So what you're saying is that the data Imperial put into the model, I mean, there's the old thing, rubbish in, rubbish out. Well, that may be a little bit extreme, but you see my point. You're saying that you didn't trust the data that went into the modeling. And you were right, because you didn't have a lockdown and you've had nothing like 85,000 deaths.
No, but I think you always have to be very careful about models. Models are not really made to do prognosis. Models are made to test certain different kind of measures that you take and try to see what kind of effect they might have and so on. And if you want to use them as a prognostic model, you have to be very careful and really look very carefully at the in data you look, because as you said, rubbish in, rubbish out. And if you like in this case, don't really know what kind of data to put in. You have to be very careful about what you think about what the outcome is going to be.
You must feel vindicated now, though, in not following the consequences of that modeling. 85,000 deaths. In reality, I think Sweden at the moment is around 5,700, 5,800 deaths. It's a terrible amount. Any death's a terrible amount, but it's nowhere near 85,000.
No, I don't really like talking about vindication or not. This is not a competition. We're not trying to win any kind of award. We are just trying to do our best for public health and try to keep this pandemic in a way that our society can handle it.
It makes me wonder, though, and it's not really a question that you could answer. It does make me wonder if the British government interrogated the imperial data going in to the same degree that you did.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question for somebody to look into the future.
Indeed. When you look at it, and I perfectly understand you don't want to give advice to Britain or anything like that, but at least theoretically, on the basis of Sweden's experience, should Britain have avoided a lockdown?
As you said, and as I said before, I don't really feel comfortable about reviewing what's happening in different countries. I'm sure we're all trying to do our best in the circumstances we have. But I think if we could have had a little bit more of openness and we could have had some more discussion on a tactical level between different countries before a lot of these decisions were taken, I think we could have arrived something together that maybe would have worked slightly better than the situation that we see right now.
Let's look at where we are right now. Yesterday, Spain announced 11,000 new cases. France, over 10,000 new cases. The United Kingdom, about 3,000 new cases. Are we, at least in these countries and these parts of Europe, are we now in a second wave of COVID?
There's a lot of discussion if we should call this a second wave or not. I mean, COVID is different than the flu when it comes to how it spreads. It spreads much more heterogeneously, it spreads much more in clusters. But obviously, this is a second kind of increase of the number of cases. It is kind of probably a kind of COVID second wave, which is of course different than a flu second wave. And definitely it's causing and probably also will cause a lot of harm in many countries still. And it definitely gives us a signal that this pandemic is far from over.
But new Swedish cases yesterday were only 224 versus 11,000, as I say, in Spain, over 10,000 France, 3,000 in the United Kingdom. Why only 224 in Sweden?
As many questions, only the answer lies in the future. I mean, there's of course at least two different ways to look at it. One is maybe we are a bit earlier in the phase than many other countries. Our downturn on the curve came later. So maybe this is something that's still going to happen in Sweden. We don't know. On the other hand, I think there is a big difference. And the big difference is that we haven't had a severe lockdown that we open up. We have had the same measures in place all the time. Sustainable measures, we believe, even if the population is getting slightly tired also in Sweden. But having the same measures in time gives a bit more stability to the development. And I hope, and I think that's what we're seeing right now.
So just to be clear, in layman's language, is it broadly your case that because you don't really have people coming out of it, you didn't have people coming out of lockdown because you weren't really in lockdown. You had some restrictions, of course, not the kind of lockdown Britain or France or Spain had, that because of that, you might be able to avoid the kind of second wave we're seeing in other countries. Yeah,
we sincerely hope that. I think we have reasonable reasons to hope for that. We'll still see probably outbreaks here and there in Sweden. We have seen a few small ones so far. But now we have a lot of systems in place. We do a lot of contact tracing, we do a lot of testing, and we managed to break the transmission chains around these small outbreaks very well so far. And we really hope we can continue like that. And it looks good right now.
Am I right in thinking that, looking back, that you had something that could have been seen as a second wave in June, that you had got on top of the figures and then they started for a while to get worse again?
No, that was all of it due to a huge increase of testing. We went from maybe 20,000 tests a week to 80,000 tests a week. And of course, then we found a lot of cases that we haven't found before. So that's completely an artifact caused by increased testing.
I see. Only 13 COVID-related cases are in intensive care now in Sweden. The 7-day average of COVID-related deaths is zero. What are you now predicting in Sweden for the autumn and going on into the winter?
Yeah, as I said, what we believe in and what we hope in is that we're going to continue with this fairly low level of spread that we have right now, and that we most likely is going to have outbreaks in different places. We have a few in ice hockey teams right now, and young adults in general, a little bit here and there, but very small. But that we will be protected by the measures we have in place with the help of some level of immunity in the population. And also we have a lot of resources in place to take care of these small outbreaks now in a completely different manner than we could do this spring.
Many governments, including the British government, are now tightening controls again. Local lockdowns are proliferating. Local lockdowns in Britain now cover about 13 million people, areas where 13 million people live. There's even talk of a second national lockdown in government circles. When you see that, what do you think? What do you say to that?
I really understand that now when you've seen what this disease can do. I mean, the death toll we had in many countries and so on, that you really want to have something in place that you can stop this upsurge that we see all over the place. If it needs to be complete lockdown, so you can do it with a bit more, maybe what you can call a surgical precision, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, in Sweden, we try to work very much with a little bit more precision in areas where we do know that there is a risk of spread. That's why we have been quite clear about restaurants. They need to have a service in place that does not include or prevents crowding and prevents spread in those places. And we have really cut down on big events and so on. And so far, that kind of a little bit more precision-like instruments have proven quite effective in Sweden.
Just a few more questions since I've got you here. You always denied that herd immunity was your policy, but I've seen you say that widespread immunity is now helping to explain the recent drop in Swedish cases. So is it not de facto herd immunity has been the policy?
No, not the policy. I mean, because that always sounds like we are prepared to sort of sacrifice people to arrive at something. We are definitely not prepared to sacrificing people in the Swedish system. That's completely opposite of what we have as a goal in public health. But you cannot deny, and I think nobody in the world denies, that if you have a reasonable amount of people that are immune in your population, that will slow down the spread and will definitely increase the effectiveness of any kind of measure you put in place.
What did you make just on that, an article in the British Medical Journal? It was published only yesterday. I'm not sure you've seen it yet. It says that about half of us could have T-cell immunity to COVID, which is, as I understand it, separate to the antibody immunity. Is that possible, and would that be encouraging?
That would, of course, be encouraging that we already have such a big part of our population immune to it. It wouldn't really fit in the models we have used so far, because we wouldn't really have had the spread that we see if that big part of the population were immune already from the beginning. And we can at least, yeah, I mean, I think the judgment on that is still out. There might be something in it. How big of an effect it has remains to be seen. The problem with T-cell immunity is that it's very difficult, or not very, but it takes a lot of resources to measure it. And that's why it's not been done in a big time yet. We have done some at the Karolinska Institute pointing in a similar direction. But if it's really going to help us or not, I think the future we can only tell that.
Do you have an idea of what percentage of the Swedish population is now likely to be immune?
It's been proven to be very difficult to measure because the spread is so heterogeneous. So when we measure in different population, we get figures all the way from 30% of the population in some areas of Stockholm to down to 5% among the blood donors in the south of Sweden. We believe that in the Stockholm area, maybe somewhere between 20 and 30%, on the national level, maybe around 15%, but this is just guesses based on fairly scant data so far.
Two more questions. One that one of our viewers asked me to ask you. And he wanted to know what would happen if we allowed all non-vulnerable people to carry on life as normal during a second spike, but we super isolated the elderly and the vulnerable. So in other words, no lockdown for the majority of the population. Is that a possible course of action?
I think it's very, very difficult, because it's very difficult to isolate different parts of the population from each other like that. I think all our experiences prove that. We have now managed to fairly well isolate this small 70 out 80,000 people of the sort of most vulnerable in Sweden, but that has taken a lot of effort, and it's very difficult. The sort of half isolation we have made for the above 70s in Sweden has proven to take quite a big toll on that group, because they really feel isolated. There's a lot of mental problems and so on in that group. So I don't think it would work, and I think that the consequences would also be probably more than we would like to think about.
The British government is worried that Christmas, as we've known it, might be cancelled. I don't think that's happened since the days of Oliver Cromwell in Britain. In Sweden, you're now talking about letting people visit care homes again, and the size of gatherings could go up from 50 to perhaps 500. Will there therefore be something like a normal Christmas in Stockholm?
It depends on what you mean with a normal Christmas. I think the kind of normal Christmas that you celebrate within your family, that I think to a certain extent, or hope that we can have with proper measures in the home, and try to take special measures with our elderly relatives. But once again, yes, we are allowing visits to the elderly homes, but we are giving very strict advice on how they should be done. Once again, we try to do this with a kind of precision. So we take away the risks, but we let things happen. And the same thing with increasing the amount of people from 50 to 500. Yes, we say it's okay with 500 if you do it in a place where people have assigned seats that are at least 1 meter apart from each other, and that you can arrange entrance and exit in a way that there are no crowding. So yes, we are opening up, but we are opening up with a lot of care, not to cause any undue problems.
Sounds like we might be coming to Stockholm to join you for Christmas, Anders.
You're always welcome.
My Swedish wife will be very happy if we do that. Anders Tegnell, thank you for joining us on this Spectator TV special, and for going through a difficult time, these issues that I know you've been grappling with. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.